speak with us today. So Calvin, let me tell you about Calvin. So Calvin is an experienced writer, historian, and genealogist, and he regularly gives presentations and leads discussion groups on genealogy, African-American folklore, and history. He is the author of his forthcoming book, McMasters Will, The Scheme That Almost Freed Us, which details the controversial life and freedom fight of his enslaved great-great-grandfather, Aaron McMasters. Calvin is a proud native of Siler City, North Carolina. Like myself, a graduate of the North Carolina School of Science and Math, go Unis, graduate of Duke University, and a former Fulbright scholar to Morocco. He currently resides in DC, where he is principal and co-founder of RC Communications, a public relations and marketing firm. So Calvin, without further ado, please do go ahead and share your screen and get started in sharing your talk with us today.
Thank you so much. I was all prepared to tell everybody we were both unicorns. If you didn't, unicorns were our high school mascot. So good to be in great company. So I will share my screen here. So can everyone see the screen, hear me and everything?
Yes, you're great.
Perfect. Good. Okay, so welcome everyone today. I am here, as you can see, in Washington, D.C., but as you can hear, I am from Chatham County, North Carolina. Very proud to be from Siler City. And so if anyone else is from Siler City or Chatham County, please give me a shout out in the chat. You know, a couple of things I just want to get out in the beginning to kind of let you know where this presentation is going is one, I'm not Quaker. I didn't grow up Quaker. I sometimes define myself as a recovering Baptist. I got into studying Quakers and how it relates to genealogy through the research for my book that we were just talking about, McMasters Will, which is the freedom struggle of my great-great-grandfather, Aaron McMasters. And like I'm sure all of you, as you go down this genealogy and history, path, you find that there are things that you become knowledgeable about, or you have to find out more about because it relates to your family tree that you weren't expecting. So when I, about 4 years ago, started writing about my great-great-grandfather, I never thought that I would have this, I don't want to say detour because I like it, trying to find out more about Quakers. So that's how I got into this. So just want to make sure that when we talk about we have the questions, and, I would definitely want to hear everybody's questions. I'm not an expert on Quaker theology, but I do have some insights to share as far as Quaker history in North Carolina and how it can be very valuable to us as genealogists. The second thing is that I want to try to keep this presentation on the short side, because I think probably the most valuable part will be to hear your questions and hear your comments, because I'm going to go through very briefly major tenets of Quakerism and their practice of keeping records that I think will be useful to you. But I think that will also be useful as well is to hear your Quaker connections and to kind of hear your brick walls. And if there's anything that I can share to kind of break down those brick walls, well, that is why I am here. Okay, so put your questions in the chat, of course, and then after the presentation and some announcements, we will go through that. So let me get started real quick and just give you my overview of Quakers in North Carolina and how that could possibly be important to your research journey. And I put some things in here. Some of you who are probably familiar with Quakers, more familiar than I am, are going to know some of these basic lingo, as I call it, some of the basic tenets. I've tried to make it to where we can get everybody on the same page so that we can talk about how Quaker records and Quakerism can help us in genealogy. So just very quickly on this first slide here, who are the Quakers? And so, like I said, this is just some of the basic things I just wanted to point out. The official name is the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers, that name came from the kind of reputation that Quakers had in England, that when they experienced the Holy Spirit, they would quake, or that they would shake. So that's where Quakers come from. But it's officially the Religious Society of Friends. The founder of Quakerism is George Fox, 17th century English dissenter. When you think about Quakers and how they kind of distinguish themselves from other religious groups, particularly in the United States and North Carolina, two things that kind of stand out to me are pacifist and plainness. Those are two things that really describe what they're about. Okay. Now, also, one of the things that are attached to the Quaker legacy in North Carolina is suspicions and ignorance, because they didn't swear oaths, so that made people suspicious of them. They did not perform military service, and they were really averse to worldliness. And of course, what worldliness meant changed over time. But that's just a basic overview of who Quakers are. Now, what I think is really important as we talk just a moment about Quaker speak. And I know this may be knowledge that some of you already have, but I just want to go over it pretty quickly. Some of the things that I had to learn, because as I said at the beginning, these are things that I did not grow up learning. I learned in the process of researching for my family history and for writing my book. First of all, a friend. They are a member of the Religious Society of Friends, okay? So whenever you see that recorded, you will often see that for those of you who are researching Quaker records. A very common salutation of Quakers is respected friend. So that's, of course, what that's referring to. Meeting. This is a very important one, and that it can be kind of confusing. It's and like I said, there are so many definitions for what people say a meeting is. The best way I can describe it that I found is it's the congregation for worship is a meeting, and it's also an administrative body for business. Now, kind of what makes this a little bit more confusing is if you take North Carolina, for example, if you're referring to the administrative body for business, the meeting is defined on, how often they met. So you have the North Carolina yearly meeting, which is going to come up a lot in research. But then each of the congregations that you find, and we'll have a map that's going to show some of the Quaker congregations in Central North Carolina, they're also referred to as a meeting. I'm near the Rocky River in between Chatham and Randolph counties. And so one of the Quaker congregations near me is Rocky River Friends Meeting. So keep that in mind. It's a very important word that has obviously a worship context for the congregation, but also a business one, because these administrative bodies, such as the North Carolina yearly meeting, hand down advice, as they call it, on critical issues. And in this time period, we're talking about a lot of it dealt with slavery. We have disownment, which is termination of membership by a meeting. And I find that one of the most fascinating things that that I didn't know about before I started researching Quakers. You could get disowned for, and I put some examples here. One of the most common and one of the ones most related to genealogical research is MOU, marriage out of unity. Obviously marrying someone who was not a Quaker. Now, if some of you are thinking, I may or may not have Quakers in my family tree, or that may not be something that I've been focusing on, this is why it's important, because guess what? Many people who were disowned for marriage out of unity, it was because they married non-Quakers. And it's a way that you can find records for family members. So there are a lot of folks, a couple of governors in North Carolina before the Civil War that I had to research, who were from Quaker families, but they had been disowned for one reason or another. And usually it was around either possessing slaves or marrying out of unity. So keep in mind that as you think about the people in your tree that you're researching that may have a Quaker connection, don't discount the fact their Quaker connection may be that who they married or who they were associated with was kicked out or disowned from the Quakers. And so that's why their records are still valuable to you. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about the style of writing. And I know that we mentioned that just a little bit in the first section. I find this incredibly interesting that whenever you're looking at records and you're trying to decide if this was a Quaker who is being talked about in the record, or if it's a Quaker that's written something, there are very key signs that you can look for to see if it's Quaker writing. And for example, the use of the word thee and thy. Now, of course, 15th, 16th century, that was very common, but we're talking about like 18th, 19th century, where that was still being used. And so that's what I call a bit of Quaker speak. Also, a really key indicator is numbers for days and months, as in like the first month, the third day, because days and months were named for pagan deities. So Quakers, when they wrote their records, that's how they wrote out instead of the days, they would use the numbers. This is really, really important if you're especially doing like wills and you're looking for clues. That is a very, very Quaker thing, as I would call it. And if you see someone that they're putting like the first month, the third day, that's a clue that it may be a Quaker. Now, one of the things that I just want to just give you an example of in my writing about my great grandfather, who was enslaved, and he was the subject of a scheme that was led by Quakers to free him. He had Quaker confidants. We call them the trusty friends. That was the name that they gave themselves. They kind of had a double meaning. They were friends, of course, of the former enslaver who had died and left everything in his will to my great-great-grandfather who was enslaved. So you can imagine the legal consequences that had. But they were also literal friends. They were Quakers. And one of the letters, which I just have on the screen, that I just wanted to point out is it's Newmarket, North Carolina, which for those of you familiar with Randolph County, that's in Randolph County. Notice how it says 6th month, 3rd, and that's day, 1845. And this was obviously written by Joseph Newland, who was a Quaker, but that's a key indicator that, hey, a Quaker may have written this. And if you'll also notice right below it, when he mentions Henry Ellison, he said respected friend. Henry Ellison was not a Quaker, but that's how he was referred to in this letter. So kind of keep those things in mind, look out for those, because they can give you an indication that a Quaker was involved. Also, just want to here's some other of my family's records, something I want to point out, and we'll get to where you can find these in just a moment. Quakers kept extensive records, especially for birth, for marriage, disownments, and migration. And when you think about developing your family tree, doing your genealogy, those are the most important things that you can think of. And they kept really, really great records about that. And I pulled this record from one of the meetings in North Carolina, and there's a couple of things I want to point out about it. First is, notice it says at the top, Masters Abigail. So these are the masters with the last name Masters in this record. My family's name was McMasters, okay? Because of history that will be a whole nother session about the Quakers in England and why they came to the United States. Scottish names with MC for son of, like McMaster, son of the master, were kind of signals of not being Quaker. And a lot of times when people would convert to Quakerism, or if they would marry someone who was a Quaker and so they wouldn't be disowned, they would, become a Quaker themselves, they changed their name. So this is Abigail Masters. This is a niece of my great-great-grandfather. And she changed it because McMasters was not the kind of Quaker name you would suspect. But if we look at the records that they kept, this is a treasure trove of extremely valuable information. And I just want to highlight some of the things. First of all, we see with George here, he was disowned. And if you look at the numbers and the references, the box is kind of hiding it. If you look up the minutes from that particular meeting, you can see why George was disowned. If we go down a little bit further, we can see that Morris Masters, one of the descendants of Abigail, was accepted into this particular meeting after having acknowledged military training, which obviously that would conflict with the pacifist nature of Quakers, and marriage out, as in marriage out of unity. But he was allowed to be in the meeting. I have to tell you, reading through some of the Quaker meeting minutes for some of the things that people were disowned for are quite scandalous. And their responses were quite scandalous. One of the people that I had to research, his name is George C. Mendenhall, which if you're from anywhere in Central North Carolina, particularly Guilford County, you know that name. He was disowned because when he married his second wife after his first wife died, or his first wife had enslaved people that she inherited. He was disowned because as a consequence of that marriage, he became a slave holder. He was never officially readmitted, but he was also extremely wealthy. So he supported the Quaker meetings around Guilford County with money, even though they had disowned him. So there's some very, very interesting stories there. So as you see from this example, there's a lot of information that can possibly help you, even if the person you're researching isn't a Quaker. Just want to go over a little bit about Quaker places. For my particular history and that I've been researching, I'm right where that gold triangle is, right there on the line of Randolph County and Chatham County. Now, at different points during Quaker migration, they were spread across central North Carolina, but particularly when you look at Randolph, Chatham, then also Guilford, Orange, Alamance, these were very, very strong Quaker communities. So that also may be something that you want to look into, because if you are researching any of those counties, particularly in central North Carolina, there may be Quaker records that have insightful things for you in your research. Want to share this as well. And by the way, you'll see a couple of these graphics. I have to give credit to Mr. Kirkman, and I'll have the information about his book at the end. It's Break Every Yoke. He basically wrote the encyclopedia, as I call it, of the North Carolina Manumission Society, which was a Quaker-led group that was, fighting to end slavery, or at least ameliorate, as they call it, the condition of slaves. And so some of these illustrations come from his book. The Granville line, which I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, and how it relates to North Carolina genealogy, that basically is where, along that line in the central part of North Carolina, that's where you're going to find really, really strong Quaker communities. Okay. Wanted to just briefly say this, because like I said, there's a whole other talk about how and why Quakers came from England to the colonies down to North Carolina. But this just shows some of the Quaker colonies, and where obviously they were in the coast at first, and then they spread, at least in North Carolina's case, to the center at the height of Quakerism, which I always kind of put it around 1790, 1800. Now, here's another, as I indicated with the meetings, these are the Manumission Society of North Carolina, that they had obviously their meetings to, fight slavery, but they met around Quaker meeting houses. And this is a map of the kind of Quaker meetings on North Carolina Manumission Society chapters in, between 1816 and 1834. And if you look around, this map, I'm sure that a lot of these names mean a lot to you if you're from any of these counties, from, you know, Chatham to Orange to Randolph, Guilford, and you see the Granville line right there. A lot of them are named after water sources. So you have Deep River, Rocky River, Forbush Creek, Brush Creek. They were meeting. So it became the Rocky River Friends meeting, you know, the New Garden meeting, right, you know, outside of Greensboro. So, and I'll include this in, I'm going to send a handout around after that, you know, will be sent to you. I'll include these maps because as if you look at it, you can see where the concentration of these Quaker meetings were. And I'm sure that many of you have ties to these places and counties in central North Carolina. Now, very briefly, I just want to, you know, I've talked about Quakers and slavery. Every religious group, I'm sure, at that time had those in it who were opposed to slavery, and they had their reasons why. So I don't mean this that to say this is exclusive to Quakers or that they were the only denomination that opposed slavery, but I just want to point out the 5 things that really stood out as to why Quakers took such a strong and early stand against slavery. It was inconsistent with people being spiritually equal before God. um, Slavery required violence to be maintained. Obviously, it was a violent institution, and to be an enslaver, that required violence. It went against the principle of plain living and renunciation of superfluities because it was seen as, well, you know, it was a sign of wealth. Why aren't you doing the work yourself? Why are you having people who aren't being paid to do your work? That was totally against plain living. It broke the golden rule of treating others that you want in the way that you want to be treated. And this is something that's really interesting that a lot of Quaker abolitionists preached, was it tore apart enslaved families and encouraged adultery. Okay. So I want to just review, and like I said, I look forward to your questions because there's a lot of questions about this, but I just wanted to put out, in case you're wondering, you know, how did I find those minutes, or how did I find this information about the people that I was researching? There is, by William Wade Henshaw, the Encyclopedia of American Quaker Genealogy, as you see pictured here. It is available, I know, on Ancestry because I use it all the time. And there's some other resources, I think, that are free resources where you can look at not only the index, which is important. That's where I mentioned, you know, it shows kind of the genealogies of the families, their children, whether they were disowned, whether they married within unity, that type of thing. But then there are also the minutes. They're handwritten, you know, sometimes hard to read, but as genealogists, we've gotten used to that. They are on Ancestry, and they're searchable, at least by name and sometime even by keyword. So if you have someone or some place that you think might have been referenced in Quaker records, you can look through everybody calls it Henshaw's. So if you're doing Quaker research and you say Henshaw's, that's what they're referring to. And as I said, it has minutes, membership certificates, which are very, very important because when Quakers moved from one meeting to another, they had to request permission from their meeting that they attended and then present that certificate to the meeting they wanted to go to. It's valuable genealogical information because I know in the people I was researching, it showed exactly where they went and when. And you can go in the minutes and see where they actually applied, and it would say that, you know, they came from Randolph County, you know, Deep River meeting or something like that, to Indiana, Ohio, or wherever they had migrated. So definitely take note of Henshaw's. Want to really briefly touch on, we talked a lot about migration, and like I said, that the reasons for migration are many. The principal ones, and this is happening around, I'd say 1810, peaked around 1825, 1830, and kind of settled down around 1840. A lot of Quakers that had come to Central North Carolina decided to leave. And two of the primary reasons they decided to leave was that there was a huge backlash against Quakers because of, not swearing oaths, not participating in military service. There was ignorance and suspicions about them, but also because of slavery. Because one of the things that Quakers realized is if they didn't have enslaved people, they might be brought into a situation where they would have to use violence to quell a slave rebellion in their community or something. So they associated slavery with violence. And so for those two reasons, and there were a couple of others, they left. And this map shows kind of the where they ended up around the border between Indiana and Ohio. Something to keep in mind, and I know that we've talked about this in previous chats. I think I even saw this in the chat earlier today. A lot of the communities around that point in Indiana are named for where those Quakers came from in central North Carolina. So there's a Randolph County. There's a lot of times the same cities are there. And so if you are, for example, researching relatives in Indiana and you start seeing names like Randolph County or Liberty or Staley, these small communities, it's because the people that left from central North Carolina, when they went there, they named a lot of the places they moved to for the places that they had come from. I want to briefly talk about who were Quaker free Negroes. Now, I mentioned why Quakers were opposed to slavery and how that was something that they took a leadership role on, I can say, compared to other denominations, and is also why they ended up leaving, a lot of them from North Carolina. What happened was, you've got to remember, Quakers were opposed to slavery, but they also really weren't too keen on people holding political office. They definitely weren't about using violence to maintain a system or to fight against it if you're an abolitionist, So they had several maneuvers to try to improve the conditions of slavery or end slavery that didn't conflict with pacifism, being too involved in politics, and being too worldly. One of the things that they created were Quaker free Negroes. And what that means is they would tell enslavers that because in North Carolina, as in many places in the South, you couldn't just free your slave with the the sign of a pen, but there were huge bonds in North Carolina, over $1,000 each. So it was out of reach for most enslavers, even if they wanted to free those they held. So the North Carolina yearly meeting would ask that, hey, in their will, leave them to us. We would be the owners of these enslaved people, and then we would allow them to live as free. It's a concept known as virtual freedom, and that's something that I write about a lot in my book because that's the situation that my great-great-grandfather was in. But what's ironic about it is in the beginning of the 19th century, Quakers, the North Carolina yearly meeting of Quakers, was the largest slave holder in North Carolina because of their policy. They call it trusteeships of these Quaker free Negroes. So they would have them donated to the yearly meeting and then allow them to live kind of as free. They did at some point kind of dabble in the colonization, which that's a complicated topic, but basically it was saying, hey, even if we are able to allow these enslaved people to live as free, they're not going to be accepted. So maybe we should dedicate some of our resources to relocating them to northern states, to Haiti or to Liberia. That obviously it didn't work on a large scale. One, because it was extremely expensive, and two, there was a really big backlash amongst Quakers because it wasn't voluntary. So they were kind of caught between, well, we want to oppose slavery, but then if we make having to move out of the country to somewhere that you don't know as a condition of it, are we really being a friend to the people that we're trying to help? And as I said, with the movement to the West, that's one of the reasons why a lot of Quakers had said, we would just rather move to a place where the slavery issue is not so big and something that we would have to potentially deal with. The having of Negroes is becoming a burden. I'll have at the end a book by that title. That is a quote from the North Carolina Yearly Meeting. It's around just before 1800, where they were being asked by the local meetings, hey, what do we do about, the enslaved people that have been left to us? How do we treat them? How do we integrate them into our societies? And that was how that piece of advice opened, that the having of Negroes is become a burden. And I just say a new ecumenical way. Just very quickly, when I mentioned the North Carolina Manumission Society, it was the anti-slavery group that sought to free my great-great-grandfather. The reason it was created, and it wasn't just, here are a group of Quakers trying to free enslaved people, was because of those suspicions and ignorance about what Quakers really were. They created groups like the North Carolina Manumission Society that weren't officially Quaker, and their leadership was usually some Quaker, some not, so that it would get the support of people who wouldn't have joined a Quaker institution. One of the really cool things that I love about that, it's a phenomenon called Friends of Friends. The North Carolina Manumission Society was headed by people from various denominations, Methodists, other Protestants, and Quakers, and they were known as Friends or Friends of Friends. And just a couple of images that I want to share with you. This is the full page of a letter from a man named Jesse Kemp. He was one of the earlier Quaker records that I'd shown. This was a letter that he had written to my great-great-grandfather, basically saying, get out of North Carolina and come to Indiana. And if you don't like it here, maybe we can go to Canada and help you get there. And this picture is Jesse Kemp and his wife, who were from Randolph County, North Carolina, but fled during the Great Migration in the late 1830s to Park County, Indiana, because of the slavery question. Now, really quickly, one of the things that I just want to point out here is, you're probably thinking, how does this help me in my research? Just one kind of quick example. My great-great-grandfather, before he married my great-great-grandmother, had several relationships with white women in Randolph County. Now, you can probably imagine an enslaved person having children by local white women was a little bit controversial, right? And so in one of these instances, it was Quakers that came in to save the child because they were worried that because of the backlash of the child being born between an enslaved man and a white woman, that there be danger brought about from the child. And one of the things I got to research, because I grew up hearing this about your great aunt Cynthia, they had to take her away in the middle of the night and all of these things. So when I started researching, I'm like, I've got to find out the facts. What was this really about? And this is one quick example. You'll see here on the left, this is from the 1850 census. This is in Alamance County. The white woman was named Quincy Cabanis. And then, of course, my great-great-grandfather, Aaron McMasters. The child was named Cynthia. Now, she's born in 1842. So around this time, she would have been 8 or 9. As I'm researching, if you'll notice on the right side, there is this family, and there's no racial category in this kind of like cutout. It's because they're all white. So they had a little W at the top. But if you notice, you have like Margaret Pritchard, and it's got, her daughter, Margaret, William. And then there at the bottom, you have Cynthia Cabanis, 9 years old. Okay. Which this is in Alamance County next door. I'm like, why in the world was Cynthia staying there? That's because the story that I'd always heard was true, that the Quakers had taken her in as their own and she could pass as a white child. And one of the things that I found to support that is if you look under, you have like Peter Stout, his name there, all the different, his children and those in his household. Take a look at this. Whereas Peter Stout, son of Samuel and Rachel Stout, this is a Quaker record that I found, he was a very active Quaker in Cane Creek, North Carolina, that after a lot of other research, I found that this is something that he helped kind of facilitate. These children from mixed relationships, kind of putting them in different Quaker households that they would be taken care of. So if you go back here to the census, where it has Peter Stout, because of Henshaw's genealogy and the index, I was able to find out a lot about Peter Stout as a Quaker, and that made a lot of this make sense. That I'm like, oh, that's why she was in that household right around Quakers in the Cane Creek area of Alamance County. And just wanted to show you like a really quick picture. On the left here, you have Wincy Cavanis, who famously wrote in her journal that she was a teenager when she saw her father and her uncle beat an enslaved man to death, and she made a vow that she would never give birth to a potential enslaver. So of the children that she had, I think there were 7 or 8, they were all from relationships she had with enslaved people. And the product of that, one of the products is the encircled woman that I have on the right, my great aunt Cynthia, Cynthia McMasters Phillips, who once she was an adult, she went to Moore County and it was very open about the relationship with the Quakers and how they had to shield her during that time in the 1840s. Another quick example, because I want to give you time for your questions. This is a snapshot of some of the Quaker records in Henshaw's. Jesse Kemp, who I had mentioned, wrote the letter to my great-grandfather urging him to leave North Carolina and come to Indiana. This is a snapshot from him. Now, I know that all of you as genealogists are looking at this and being like, this is a wealth of information. You know, you can see, for example, who his parents were, John and Patience, and you see the abbreviation. When you see ROCF, received of Back Creek monthly meetings, that shows you where they were at the time, shows you their children. It shows you that, you know, if they had received a certificate to move to a particular meeting. This one, if you look at Patience in 1840, went to Bloomfield monthly meeting in Park County, Indiana. You can also see where their children received a membership in various places. And it's a wealth of information. It's even better than like the census records, because this tells you not only who they were, when they were born, it tells you when they moved and where. And it also gives you insights into who they married. And like I said, this is just as helpful for people who aren't Quaker, who may have been the cause of someone being disowned or married out of unity. As I just close out here, because I want to get your questions, some recommended Quaker reading. First is Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship. One of the things that I learned is, you know, once I found out all of this information about the Quakers, I then reflected on my family. You know, we have generations of ministers and pastors in my family, but none of us are Quakers. And so I kind of wondered, I was like, well, why after all of this influence from the Quakers were not more of my family, more African Americans, members of Quaker congregations? They, along with a lot of other Protestant denominations, had difficulty with integration. And one of the things that the Quakers struggled with was championing freedom, but then when it came to integrating those same people into their congregations, not everybody was on the same page. This is a very complicated issue that doesn't end with the Civil War, but continues, you know, throughout the 1800s and up to the present day. I find it fascinating that today in 2022, the majority of Quakers are actually of African descent, because of huge Quaker communities in Africa. So how ironic of that today, most Quakers are actually Black. Second book, as I mentioned, Break Every Yoke, the North Carolina Manumission Society, Roger Kirkman. It's an amazing resource, obviously on the question of slavery and the Manumission Society, but incorporated in that, he went through and did a history of all the meetings across North Carolina, all of the communities, who were the leaders of them, you know, why people would leave one meeting for another. There's a Quaker term called laid down, where when a Quaker meeting was ended, they would say it was laid down and they were absorbed into another. Roger's book is absolutely amazing to kind of describe that. And then also Toward Freedom for All, Hiram Hilty, he associated with Guilford College. He was a Quaker, wrote extensively on this issue, has several books. Some of them are available for free online, PDF versions, but I definitely recommend anything by him because it's very, very insightful on the Quaker question. I want to open up for questions, or I know we have some announcements first. Just wanted to say thank you. For giving me this time to give you this overview. Here's my contact information. I'm not lying when I say if you got a Quaker question or something interesting you find and you want to email me in the middle of the night, I'll probably answer you when you email because I'm just that interested in it. So I want to hear from you. Also, if you have anything that you think could be of help for me, I totally welcome that as well. So I'll now turn it over to our host.
Wow. Thank you so much, Calvin. You did it. Okay. Let's just give him a big hand. You guys are welcome to come on back on the screen so that he can see his applause. Right now, unbelievably, there are no questions in the chat, Calvin, but hopefully people are just kind of contemplating how they want to ask their question. If you did want to come on and ask your own question live, please go ahead and raise your hand now while Taneya and I are doing the announcements, and we will come right back to questions and share some of the comments. Calvin, take a little break, get a little sip of water or something, and we will be right back to you. Mm-hmm. And thank you again. Fabulous. And we do have some people who want to ask questions. So, okay. Taneya, you want to go first? Okay.
Yes, happy to. Wow. Okay, great presentation. I can't wait to see what some of the questions are that people are going to ask. But as far as announcements, we want to announce that what our next two dates are for us being together. So on Sunday, October 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern, we have our next research chat. So our research chat is an opportunity for us to get together and talk more in depth about what we're doing with our own North Carolina-based research. We have had themes to our research chat for a while now. So the theme, given that this is October, is trick or treat, but maybe not what you're thinking of trick or treat. So what we want to hear from you is what things have you found in your research that maybe have been tricks, as in, you start off thinking one thing and then, plot twist, something else comes as a result from that, or any particular treats that you've had unexpected in your research. So we'll talk more about that and hear from you during our research chat. Then November 6th will be our next presentation. So we'll announce the details about that as we get closer to the date, but go ahead and save the date, November 6th, 2 p.m. Eastern. That's also a Sunday. I am going to put into the chat again the link to our email list because we definitely encourage you to sign up for that. This is how we share announcements for our upcoming research chats and our meetings. And so we welcome you to join the email list so that you'll get that directly into your email inbox. And Calvin mentioned that he has resources he can share with us. So we will be distributing his resources through our email list. So if you want to grab those resources from today, definitely make sure you're on the email list. All right. Anything I'm missing, Renata?
No, you covered it all, but I just want to make sure everyone heard that if you do want to be on the receiving end of the handouts from Calvin, you need to be on our email list. So if for no other reason, please click that link, and we'll probably share it one more time towards the end, but Taneya has already put it in. Also, before Calvin's talk, I mentioned in answer to someone's question that I would share the link for the Baptist Church resources from Wake Forest University's website. So there is that link right there. It's the Baptist collection or something to that effect. And they have records from many, many of the Baptist churches. And also look on the State Archives website, because they also have Baptist church records as well as other church records. And always remember to check the Family Search catalog to see what they have for your county of interest. So there may be some overlap. Sometimes they are the same records as what was seen on another site, but it can never hurt to be thorough in your check. And I also wanted to mention that very early in Calvin's discussion, before he had even mentioned it, Carol Edmond had put in the chat that she has Henshaw's Volume 1, which Calvin then later did talk to us about, and she's willing to do lookups. Carol, that's very generous of you. We do need you to put your email address in the chat in case someone wants to reach out to you for a lookup. So if you would be willing to do that, we'd appreciate it. And if nothing is, did I miss anything, Taneya, that I was supposed to do?
No, I think you got it.
Okay, I did take that allergy pills while Calvin was talking, so my head's a little clearer. So I see we have hands up, but before we get to those, there is a question in the chat. Calvin, you have all kinds of accolades in the chat, and also many people who were making comments. So make sure you save the chat too, because many people were making connections to what you were talking about. Very specifically, Gay Barnes, you were talking about one of her ancestors. And I can't find it, but maybe she'll come on and tell us in a few minutes. But there is one question, and so I will go ahead and read that. And it's from James Wade. I wrote that down. Okay, so James Wade says the Jersey Settlement Baptist Church had both Black and white members throughout the first half of the 19th century. Were they influenced by the Quakers?
Can you hear me? There's an echo. Okay, yeah, there we go. I don't know specifically on that, but one of the things, this is why that book, Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, is helpful. I think that actually might be referenced there. The Quakers went through what they call the Black Bench period, where there was like a bench in the meeting house where African Americans were allowed to worship. And, that kind of carried on to other denominations. But I think that specific situation is referenced in that book, and I would encourage everyone to read it. Because the whole thing, as I said during this, once I got to a certain point in my Quaker research, I was like, why aren't there more Black American Quakers? And it's because of some of that. It's kind of like they really had a strategic plan for during slavery, but they didn't really have what happens after and how to incorporate people, or even if they wanted to.
Thank you. And just to piggyback on that, I'd just like to make sure everyone's aware that prior to 1865, most of the churches were Black and white. They were integrated. They had, people of color who may have been enslaved, may have been free people of color. And so that's why the church records are just so essential to your research, because you will see ancestors of color in those church records, and they will be identified as servant of, or slave of, or free person of color. So if there are church records available for any denomination for the area that you're researching, I do suggest you check them just to see if your ancestors might be in there. All right. Spencer McCall, and Mary, I do see your question.
Thank you so much. Amazing. And I kept thought I had to go to this class. And so I want to share two things with you. I am a Calvinist descendant by 3 or 4 lines. Wency is one of my 5th great grandmothers in the Calvinist line. And I heard that story before, so it's amazing to hear that, cousins. I guess we are cousins. Yes. And then I do a lot of things in the Carolinas, from that area, born and raised. And I found this neat article, I guess last year, and I just saw it again in my files last week. And it reads this: Reverend J.W. Wellens of Elon College relates this interesting experience he had in preaching to a group of free Negroes in Randolph County many years prior to the Civil War. The free Negroes referred to they were actually Waldens, and they owned much land, and they were very well liked. The Quakers had allowed them to sit in the congregation with the white folks, And also, they came to the white mourners bench. But on this occasion, Reverend Wellens, who was a founder of Elon College, you guys should know this, assigned them a certain space in which to sit and invited them to a separate mourners bench, whereupon they became insulted, raised their tents, and left the camp meeting. And so Reverend Wellens, who is a founder of Elon College, had gone to preach, according to this article. He was telling this story to the Quakers and found these 3 Negroes there. And of course, I guess didn't want them sitting with the white people and going to that bench. And so, of course, according to his own story, he told them, sit over here and go to this bench. And they said, bye-bye, and left. So I was amazed by that, of course, also.
Well, thank
and
you,
those
cousin.
white people also.
Thank you, cousin, for that. And just to show you how, which is why I love this group, because it shows you how things are connected. I don't see, I don't think Margot Williams is here today, but she's a regular member of the group. She is the wealth of knowledge of many things, particularly on the Waldens question. And even one of the things I found out is one of Aaron's children, Amos McMasters, married into the Walden family, that particular one you're talking about. And so I'm reminded of at our family reunion in Randolph County, where my 96-year-old great uncle got up and said, I love our history. He mentioned everybody had light eyes. He said the light eyes in our family are ancestral. And I remember my cousin saying, you mean ancestral? They're not ancestral. And when he heard that, he said, well, you know, we're all married into each other. So I'll just
I tell you all the time.
but
my cousin 8 times over.
Exactly, mention that. So yeah, but make sure to put your contact information to me in the chat, and be glad to connect with you and share some things I have that may relate to what you were saying.
Thank you. And one last thing, of course, there are also Glovers in that area. And so a neat thing about the Glovers, I'm sure you know this too, who married the Waldens and Cavendishes, was around 1799, the white Glover, who had a common law Walden wife, his land was all left to his 4 Walden kids, who actually Walden were Glover and Walden. And of course, his great-great-grandfather was colonial governor William Glover, who was run out of the state by the Quakers. So it's kind of a neat story how he was forced out of the state by the Quakers early on with Thomas Carey and that thing with the Carey's Rebellion. So kind of a neat little nuance there.
And Methunia Glover, she didn't marry to Walden.
Yes.
That's my great-great aunt. She was my—
oh my gosh.
that's my great-grandma's sister. So yeah.
We're cousins.
Wow.
And give me your email address, because I have pictures.
I'm gonna do it now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys, before we get to the next couple of questions, and I do see the questions in the chat as well as Elisha's hand, we like to let you know that when we can tell we're running a little late, so we are going to continue, and I'll say we'll probably wrap up by 3:30. But if you do need to leave us, we will have all of this on the recording, which will be posted to our YouTube channel shortly after we finish up. So we just want to thank everyone who's been here. We hope you can stay with us until we finish up, but if you have to go, we do understand. And Calvin, I just want to say to you, or to both of you guys who were just talking, I did some Walden research for a client a couple of years ago, and that's how I got introduced to the whole phenomenon that is the Waldens. I actually bowed out of it because another researcher was also doing some work for the same client. And so that was Brian Sheffy. And I will tell you that Brian is well versed in the Waldens research. So if either of you guys wants to get with him, I'm sure he would love to, tete-a-tete with you on the Waldens. So before, let's see, we'll do Elisha, and then after him, we'll go to Mary LaValle.
All right. Thank you, Calvin, for this wonderful presentation. You just the title brought me back. Let me know I had to go back in my research and deal with some things I had been putting on the back burner. So one of those things I had been putting on the back burner is that my second great grandmother was in the Upriver Friends meeting in Quakerism County. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't figure out how she got there. I've saved about a dozen documents related to her, but I've not yet gotten to the bottom of it. I'll go back and read those documents. I do know that when she got married, the meeting sent somebody to witness her marriage. All right, and now I think I know why. because she married a Winslow. And Winslow's and my family started the Methodist church in that area. And so that's one of the documents. I have to go back and look at. So you put me back because I had gone on to other things, but I'll go back to that. And the other interesting thing was that, then there was a Williams family that was part of that church. And I remember as a child, we knew they were Quakers. We didn't know a lot of details. We know that my father's, one of his closest friends was Mr. Williams, who was a Quaker. And they had a great relationship over time. They did some farming together, did all kinds of things. And they thought they were, we were always told they were really nice people, really good people and happy. But then you mentioned that whole segregation thing, that whole thing on when they integrated schools in the 60s, that's when our fragmentation really got in there, because Mr. Williams was one of the first people to send his children to the segregation academy so they wouldn't have to go to school with our colored children. This is late 60s. So that put a whole new color on it, but the friendship remained until my father's death. In fact, Mr. Williams was at my mother's funeral. But anyway, so you put me on a whole lot, put me back to that train of research. A lot of documents I need to review. She was in the meetings. I first saw her show up in 1836. And Pleasant Winslow was her name. She was born in 1795. But she married the Winslows, which is my mother's side of the family. So thank you for getting me back to that. And some of the things you shared would be very helpful.
I'm glad for that. And you reminded me of something. I want to give a shout out to Guilford College. The archives there, they are absolutely amazing. And it got to the point where I probably found just as much helpful information from the Quaker archives at Guilford College as I have from the North Carolina archives. And a lot of the things that you mentioned about the different meetings and some of those real specific records, Guilford has them. A lot of them are online, and the ones that aren't, you can make an appointment and go there and see them. It's a wealth of information. And that's, like I said, right outside Greensboro, North Carolina.
Yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Calvin, we have a question in the chat from Mary LaValle, and she's got a two-part question. First, she asked, did the North Carolina Quakers intersect with the Moravians who came from Pennsylvania to establish the Moravian community? And then she asked if you have found information in the archives at Swarthmore or Haverford colleges on Quakers who were free.
The second question first. Yes, I have. And they're associated with, there's an annual conference, or I think it's biannual, conference of Quaker archivists and historians. And they have a wealth of information there, particularly for a lot of the Quakers that moved from North Carolina to Indiana. Now, on that first question, so here's why the Moravians are really interesting. I can't off the top of my head think of any direct connection, but they were in essentially the same place. The Moravians were right around current day Winston-Salem. Mm-hmm. And so obviously these were religious communities that had their own kind of unique qualities, I'll just put it like that people kind of wondered about. But for me in my research, one of the things that I found is the Moravians and the Quakers seem to be really, really active around the same time. And the Moravians also kept extensive records on just about everything. And one of the things that I included to kind of color what I write in my book is when I write about the different meetings, and not Quaker meetings, but the actual meetings of like the abolitionist, where they talked about, what time they got started that day, what was going on in the world. I cross-referenced that with the Moravian records, who they were really, really interested in the weather. Like they talked about the weather a lot. And so I was able to put those together to say, this is obviously what these Quakers were doing, but then the Moravians 5 miles down the road were talking about how there hadn't been any rain and how people were kind of upset because they didn't know where the rain was coming. So there are a lot of connections like that I found.
Oh, that's interesting. So the Moravian archives are held in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, if you're ever interested in looking at those. And a lot of them are in the German language or Swiss, but the last time I spoke to them and verified the marriage of my 7th great grandparents, who both went to North Carolina to establish Beth Arbara, they read them right to me. They were able to tell me right on the phone. So that's a worthy place to look for stuff.
And I think I have it right with the Moravians where they settled. The Indian name was Wachovia.
Mhm.
And then that became obviously, eventually the bank, Wachovia, the First Union then became Wells Fargo and all of that. But it's all from that community you just mentioned around what's present day Winston-Salem.
That's my understanding. Yes.
So, mhm.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question from Gay, the source of the Kirkland maps.
I was
Yeah.
on mute.
Oh, yeah, yes. It's from his book, Break Every Yoke. You can get it online. It's a huge volume. And it's valuable for a lot of reasons, but as I look at the chat, one of the things that I think will be valuable for a lot of folks is he has a very detailed index of basically Quakers and friends of friends. So if you have any family names that you think might be involved or whatever with Quakers or Quaker communities, Roger's book has that. And Roger's in North Carolina. He's very, I talked to him a little over a year ago, very active with Gilbert College. He's a wealth of knowledge himself, but those maps came from his book.
Thank you.
And Calvin, do you have a link to your book?
I have a link to my website. We're in the editing phase and hope it'll be out beginning of next year.
Okay, I have that then. I'll go ahead and put that in.
Okay.
I was trying to remember if it was out yet or not, so I'm putting the website in right now.
Well, had it not been for the Quakers, it would have been out last year. But then, of course, I had to go down this Quaker path, which of course enriched it, of course, even more.
Right. Okay. Taneya, have you seen any additional questions?
No, not for Calvin. Spencer asked a question to Gay about her connections.
Oh,
so
yeah.
again, more connections in the chat. But no, I don't see any more questions for Calvin.
All right, Gay, Spencer wants to know if your Baines are from Alamance and Caswell County.
Absolutely.
Uh-oh. Get that email address in there.
Right. Please email me. I put my email in there. I'm happy to talk to anybody about anything. And Calvin, I think you're so wonderful.
For that.
Absolutely wonderful.
All right, we've got two more hands that just went up, and I think this is where we'll have to wrap it up. So we have a question from Tony Grant, and after Tony, Reginald Hayes.
Thanks. Great presentation, Calvin.
Thank you.
I had a question. I put it in the chat, but I'll.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I didn't see
It's okay. Basically, I was wondering if I had cousins in Barbados that were Quakers, and they had slaves. Then I also knew of Quakers that were in England that made guns and ammunition. When did all the Quakers decide that slavery was no good? Or because it seems like it was more like almost like a sect would decide not to have slaves, or was it universally Quaker thing to do?
Well, the short answer is because there was a debate, and one of the things that's interesting is with the Quaker records, you can actually follow the debate. The short answer would be, I think 1799, 1800 is when the North Carolina Yearly Meeting officially came out and said, slavery is bad, but here's where it got complicated. Because in North Carolina, you couldn't just free those you enslaved. A lot of Quakers who maybe had owned enslaved people had said, well, am I really doing God's work if I just, send them off to, say, a free state where they're not being taken care of? You had some people saying, well, how do I deal with the fact if I marry someone and they inherit enslaved people? So around 1800 was when the Quaker meeting came down and said, yeah, let's officially be against this. But how that played out looked different. And you had a lot of people who were disowned or who were estranged from Quaker communities because of the question of slavery. One of the most interesting examples of that is George C. Mendenhall. I am fascinated by him because if you Google him and just read like the first few results, you hear, famously freed all of these slaves and everything like that. But it's a little more complicated. What happened was his wife, as I'd mentioned in the presentation, she'd inherited them when her father died. And then he would make it known that if they were enslaved people that weren't being treated right, he had enough money that he would go buy you from your owner and then you would become his property. The kind of weird thing is that he said, I'll free you, but we need to prepare you. We need to like get you educated. We need to like make sure that you are trained so that you can actually enjoy the freedom. So he improved it, but then some of these people were still enslaved by him for 20, 30 more years before he actually worked to maybe move them to Ohio and Indiana. So there was a lot of criticism at the time of him is, was he really freeing them or was he just getting as much work out of them as he could? And then when they weren't valuable enough, then finally sending them to Ohio and Indiana. So it's complicated, but that's something that definitely Quakers dealt with. And it's a lot more open how they dealt with it because of the records they kept than I would say for other denominations.
Thank you. And I actually have a question too that I think is going to kind of piggyback on that if time allows. If not, I'll just ask it later, Calvin. But we have Reginald, which will be our last community question, I think. You're on mute.
Yes. Thank you, Calvin. Great presentation. And I just wanted to give some shout outs to some famous Quakers that, that research. Levi and Catherine Coffin. Levi was born in Gifford County. I consider him as the European Harriet Tubman. So,
President Levi, of the Underground Railroad, as he called
yes,
him.
Levi, yes. Which they was teaching the enslaved Africans that was in North Carolina. They wanted to teach the enslaved how to read the Bible. Mm-hmm. This theory, the enslavers didn't want that. So that's why a lot of the Quakers left out of North Carolina due to the enslavers didn't want them there because it was big money in slavery. So, but what the Levi and Catherine, they was teaching the African Americans how to read the Bible right, and that what caused, like I said, it caused a big stir in the slavers did not want that. They did not want the African Americans to know how to read the Bible correctly. So,
thank you.
So, yes.
Thank you for that. And just want to say, I had cut the slide out of famous Quakers, and I'm so glad you said that because one of the ones you mentioned was Levi. And just to let you know a little bit of the drama, if you love soap operas, when I mentioned the North Carolina Manumission Society, Levi, who was, one of the founding Quaker members right there in Central North Carolina, he quit, and he very publicly quit. And in his biography, he wrote about why he quit because he said they were too soft on the slavery question, because one of the things they had said was, if we're pacifists, we can't be obviously marching in the streets because, that might precipitate violence. So they invited enslavers to join them to say, maybe if we can just convince them, then maybe they'll, come to our side. And Levi Coffin wrote a very, very strongly worded letter. That's why he turned in his resignation and quit the North Carolina Manumission Society and then moved and migrated.
Thank you so much.
Also, I want to give a shout out to my the General Nathaniel Green from Rhode Island, he's known as the Fighting Quaker. So I did a lot of research on that, and also there's a lot. Ulysses Grant, the Civil War general, General Grant married a Southern gal, which caused a lot of stir with his parents. his parents didn't even go to General Grant's wedding because he married a Southern girl, and they kind of disowned him. But General Grant, at the end, freed a lot of his slaves due to that. So it's
Real Housewives of the Quakers of North Carolina. I tell you, it could be.
Yeah,
I tell you.
yes.
Yeah,
There's a
well,
lot
we
of-
are, well, Reginald, thank you for your input.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to wrap up now. Calvin, I did have a document I wanted to share and ask you about, but I will do so over email. I just want to thank everyone for coming today and for sticking around for the extra time. It's been a great session, one of our best speakers ever. I don't really like to compare because all of our presenters have been fabulous over these last 3 years, or these last 3 seasons. But Calvin, kudos. Thank you. And the thing is, it's obvious that you have so much more to share. So don't be surprised if Taneya and I don't come knocking for part 2.
Part 2, that's
especially
right.
since you mentioned the colonial period and that you have a presentation on that. We've actually been trying to secure a good speaker about the colonial period in North Carolina because that was part of what our survey results, talked about wanting. So I'm gonna stop my goodbye and just thank everyone again. Taneya, do you have any closing words?
No, just more of the same. Thank you, Calvin, for sharing your experience and wealth of information with us. I know we're all going to leave here today with great things to follow up on and things to think about and resources to go pursue. So, thank you.
And just a reminder to save the chat because it was very rich today and lots of connections are being made. And if you go back and read through it again, you may make a connection also. So thank you again. Everybody have a blessed and wonderful day. Be sure to register to join the chat on the 16th. And if we need to say a little bit more about Quaker stuff, we can start off with that day. But do get your trick or treat stories ready to share on the 16th. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.